the UK, because I don't like to differentiate between forms of discrimination and racism. And the reason I said what I said right at the beginning is because I've only come to understand this by spending a lot of time in Bangladeshi Muslim communities, is that in this country, when you look at Islamophobia, a lot of it comes from the state and is used by the state as a political weapon in a almost the inverse way to that in which anti-Semitism is used by politicians in this country to justify doing what they're doing. So we've seen, on the one hand, we've seen what I would describe as the weaponization of, and abuse of anti-Semitism to try and silence Palestinian and pro-Palestinian voices, and I would argue progressive voices generally. You know, against someone like Jeremy Corbyn would be the most obvious example that I think we're all aware of. But at the same time, and not just when Rishi Sunak stood and gave that repulsive speech in front of the door of 10 Downing Street.
Sorry, Andrew, sorry. We've just got to move a little bit further forward and there's a bag blocking the door. We can carry on, it's just that the bag needs to move.
Can someone hold up the bag so we know whose it is?
Right back, Joe's. Okay, thank
And
you.
one last thing, if anybody's lost a phone, I've got it. Anybody's lost their phone.
Whereas Islamophobia is, you know, anti-Semitism isn't weaponized against Jewish people, except a few sort of left-wing Jews who are regarded as not all Jews. Whether the way in which Islamophobia is used by the state in this country is actually against Muslim people, which is, well, and globally, of course, well, with the exception of certain countries, obviously. And that obviously makes it more dangerous because people are being identified by the state, which is the most powerful mechanism in many of our societies, as dangerous and various things by the label of being Muslim. So, yeah, how do we fight any of that? You know, and again, I'm sorry to come back to the personal where I started. But what happened to me in South Africa was that if I had listened to my teachers, to my friends, to most white South Africans, black people were different to us. And, you know, you weren't friends with them, you didn't associate with them, etc., etc. And then, thank goodness, through my mother, who, because of her experience during the Holocaust, where she lost dozens of her family, when she went to South Africa with my dad, who was South African, she saw what was happening to black South Africans and saw it as the equivalent of what had happened to European Jews under the Holocaust. And so she became involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. So as I was growing up, I did have a lot of contact with black South Africans who weren't just people who would work in our house and things like that, which was unusual. And you realize, you know, that the similarities are so much more profound than the differences. And how I experienced that in my own life is when my mom came to Britain for my wedding to my wife. She had never met my wife's family. And I thought to myself, gee, I wonder how they'll get on. And she was here for a few days and I wasn't in London, so I came back, go into my mother-in-law's house and can't find anyone anywhere. So I go upstairs and I knock on my mother-in-law's bedroom door. I come in, so I go in. And there is my mother-in-law, my Bangladeshi mother-in-law, and my Jewish mother, sitting in bed, eating rubbish, gossiping about their children, watching some nonsense on television, watching in the sense of during their conversation. And, you know, I stood there and all it did for me, and you know, I don't mean to in any way minimize the point that you're making, but again, what it just reminded me is, and believe me, we've been married for over 30 years, so I know this only too well now, that a Jewish mother and a Bangladeshi mother, you're getting the same thing. And that's the way, whoever asked the question, no, it was the gentleman who got asked the question, but I only answered one half of it for him. And that's the way you bring people together everywhere, is you actually let them interact and engage. And we can't help but realize how similar we all are. And that's the beauty of being human. But yes, of course, we have to call out every form of racism and Islamophobia, particularly because of the fact that it is effectively state-built racism.
Thank you for that. But we know